this event by NDN. I'm Rob Shapiro. I direct the Globalization Project for NDN, and I'm going to be the moderator. This is Budget Week in Washington, D.C., the beginning of Budget Month, which will then turn into Budget Year, and who knows, could end up as Budget Decade. That's certainly where the debate is heading. The battle over the budget this time brings to my mind the U.S.-Soviet arms reduction talks of the 1970s and 1980s. The issue is not whether both sides can settle everything at once, but whether each side can make a sufficient concession in the first round to keep talking and take them to the next round, or where another compromise can be reached and keep talking until the third round and so on. That is, in fact, how we brought the deficits under control in the 1980s and then again in the 1990s. One step at a time, once the two sides had found a common frame of reference. The problem right now is that we're a long way from any meeting of the partisan minds. The only common ground is that both sides, however reluctantly, see whacking away at deficits which today are running around 10% of GDP as an economic necessity. They don't, however, agree on what those economics portend. The president sees deficit reduction as part of the general effort to boost U.S. competitiveness. That's why his case hinges on combining targeted public investments in the things which contribute to growth for all industries, research and development, education and training, and basic infrastructure, with targeted spending cuts, as well as a significant dollop of revenue increases. This approach really came directly from Bill Clinton's 1992 campaign, where it was called Cut and Invest. And it's no coincidence that Gene Sperling, the president's top economic advisor today, helped manage economic policy in that campaign. It also comes directly from mainstream economics. If you invest in the things that support growth across the economy while using gradual deficit reduction to free up capital for private investment, as the public investments nudge up the returns on private investment, businesses can claim the freed up capital to expand their operations, develop new products and processes, and hire more workers. And you do it gradually so as not to undercut the demand in a fragile economy. The best argument for this approach is that it's worked in the past. When Clinton followed the script, what followed was the longest expansion in U.S. history and the strongest gains in business investment, jobs, and incomes in 30 years. To be sure, Japan demonstrated in the 1990s that very large investments in infrastructure can be wasted, particularly if special interests dictate where they go. And we've demonstrated we're not immune from that dynamic. The 2009 stimulus almost certainly would have had greater effect had Congress not substituted many of its more parochial priorities for the original plan that the president laid out. The Republican budget proposals are targeted quite differently. With defense and entitlements still largely off limits and a sense of urgency to achieve large cuts in the deficit quickly, the GOP cuts for everything else are much deeper, and they don't distinguish between public investment and other kinds of spending. The GOP logic also doesn't accommodate either higher revenues or a gradual glide path to lower deficits. Much like Prime Minister Cameron in Britain, they believe that without draconian cuts very soon, investors will give up on the United States and America could face a Greek-like default on its public debt. The hitch in this case is that the markets don't seem to buy it. If investors thought that America's creditworthiness were in any genuine risk from the current investments, we would see sharp increases in long-term interest rates because investors would demand higher returns to offset that risk. That's not happening, even though investors certainly take deficits very seriously. I believe that based on the historic record, they still trust that the two parties will find a way to contain those deficits step by step, as they always have in the past. And I think the markets are probably right that the economic costs of failing to address the deficit eventually will nudge both sides to the negotiating table. If you look at the events already scheduled, I think it's very possible the Democrats will blink first. If the Republicans are genuinely serious about holding up the debt limit, I think that will extract significant concessions from Democrats on spending, if only because they know that that no matter how it begins, the president will be held responsible in 2012 for any economic cataclysm that occurs under his watch. Then it will be the Republicans' turn to swallow higher revenues. The base will howl, but both John Boehner and Mitch McConnell know that without higher revenues, the cuts which would be required over time would make most Americans recoil. And they may very well get an assist from broad tax reform. For example, we could increase the burden on high-income people, as the president has called for, perhaps not doing it through the rates, through the Bush tax rates, offset that with cuts in the corporate tax rate, since after all, higher-income people enjoy most of the benefits of a cut in corporate rates. All that, however, will be prelude to the final discussion, which of course is entitlement reform. It's very hard to imagine that negotiation occurring without a foundation of trust built on prior agreements on spending and on revenues. That's why, at least I expect that to proceed beforehand. And people also know that I think have faced now that without serious movement on entitlements, we are going to be at economic risk for the next generation. That at least is my view of it. We have three people with much more highly educated views on the budget than I have with us today, and we're going to have a lively discussion. Let me introduce each of them right now. They will give short presentations. There will be some discussion back and forth, and then we'll open it to you to ask your questions. The first person we'll hear from is Bill Gale, immediately to my right. Bill holds the R.J. and Francis Miller Chair in Federal Economic Policy at Brookings, where he focuses on tax policy and budget policy, pensions, and saving behavior. He's the co-director of the Tax Policy Center, a joint venture of Brookings and the Urban Institute. And from 2006 to 2009, he was vice president of Brookings as head of the Economic Studies program. Prior to joining Brookings, Bill taught economics at UCLA and was a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors under the first President Bush. He received his BA from Duke and earned his PhD at Stanford. He's widely published in both scholarly and popular journals, as well as the author, co-author, or editor of numerous books. I have to tell you, all the bios read very similarly. You just have to change the schools everybody went to. Sitting next to him is Kevin Hassett, who directs economic policy studies and is a senior scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, he was a senior economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and an assistant professor of economics and finance at the Columbia University Business School. He also served as a senior economic advisor to the John McCain 2008 campaign, an economic advisor to the Bush 2004 campaign, and as the principal economic advisor to Senator McCain in his 2000 run in the primaries. He's consulted to the Treasury under both Democrats and Republicans and is the author of 6 books, as well as, again, numerous articles in both scholarly and popular journals. He received his BA from Swarthmore and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. And finally, we will hear from Stan Collender, widely seen as one of this town's 2 or 3 leading experts on the budget. He's a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Corvus Communications. He writes the popular column Fiscal Fitness for Roll Call, and before that, for a decade, he wrote a weekly column on the budget for the National Journal. In 2009, Stan's blog, Capital Gains and Games, was named by the Wall Street Journal as one of the 25 best economic blogs in the United States. He's one of the few people in this town who's worked for both the House and the Senate Budget Committee. He's also worked for the Financial Dynamics Business Communications for Fleischman Hillard, first in Marsteller, and he was the director of the Federal Budget Group and at Price Waterhouse and later at Touche Ross, and president of the Budget Research Group. He's also a former stand-up comedian and married to an actress. I guess you have to have a sense of humor if you're married to an actress. He holds a master's degree from Berkeley and a BA from NYU. We'll thank you again for attending, and we'll first hear remarks from Bill Gale.
All right, thanks, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to make a couple comments about the budget outlook generally, and then talk about the administration's budget. You're right, this is budget week. I don't know that this budget's going to be around a whole lot longer than this week, so we should talk about it now while it's still alive. But to take a step back from the budget, first, we have deficits, big deficits in the short run, we have big deficits in the medium term, and we have big deficits in the long term. So the surface answer would be we just have big deficits. We have this one issue, big deficits everywhere. And it's important to realize that although we do have big deficits everywhere, there's different causes and effects of deficits in the short, medium, and long term. In the short term, we've got deficits around 10% of GDP. Most of us think that that's actually a good thing. We had this massive collapse in the economy. The federal stimulus that was provided is helping replace aggregate demand via increasing government spending, via putting money in people's pockets through tax cuts and stuff like that. So the short-term deficits themselves, although they get a lot of attention and they've been the galvanizing force for people to think about budgets, they are not the concern. If we didn't have medium-term and long-term deficits, nobody would be worried about the short-term deficits. The medium-term deficit, if you think of like 2014 to the end of the decade, this might sound a little tautological, but it's basically just a fundamental imbalance between what we're willing to raise in taxes and what we want to spend in outlays. And there's just this fundamental imbalance that, according to my estimates and other people's estimates, is going to be about 6% of output every year. That's even after the economy recovers to full employment by 2014, 2015. We're talking about persistent 6% of GDP deficits. And that's sort of your first sign that this is not sustainable. If the economy is going all out and you've got a deficit of 6% of GDP, something is wrong, and there's just an imbalance. And then the long-term deficits build on top of that 6% of GDP. They build in increases in healthcare spending. When Rob says entitlements, I want to modify that a little bit. It's basically Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security is part of the issue, but not a very big part of the issue. It's basically Medicare and Medicaid take off after about 2021, 2022, and that gets layered on top of the imbalance that exists in the short term. Why are these an issue, the medium term and long term? There's two issues. There's a quote from a Hemingway novel where one character asks another, how do you go bankrupt? And the other guy says two ways, gradually and then suddenly, okay? And so there's a gradual effect and there's a sudden effect. The gradual effect is these budget deficits can just eat away at the capital stock. They reduce national saving, they reduce the amount we can invest, and so on. The sudden effect would be the Greek-like intervention where investors freak out and leave the country, take their assets out of the country. I don't think we're in imminent concern of that type of situation right now. I think, in fact, we're very far away from that type of situation. So the concern is more the first type, the gradual eating away at the capital stock. And that's almost more dangerous because it's invisible and it's insidious, and there's no defining event. There's no deadline when we have to make changes. So we've got this medium-term issue, which is going to gradually reduce economic performance, and we've got this long-term issue, which is fundamentally unsustainable and could create some sort of financial market reaction. And so the question then is, what's the administration doing about this? It just issued its budget this week. And the answer is basically that they have a placeholder budget. They're accepting the short-term deficits. There's not a whole lot you can do about that. On the medium term, they're offering modest changes. On the surface, the medium-term outlook looks okay. It gets down to, the budget deficit gets down to 3% of GDP. But there are a number of things that they do to get there that are not really well defined. A number of kind of magic asterisks that account for upwards of $1 trillion in spending. There's another magic asterisk called GDP growth, where the administration's estimates of GDP over the next 10 years is basically 4% higher than CBO's. That doesn't sound like much, but it turns into about $2 trillion in extra revenue and reduced interest costs. So there's an issue about whether they're really solving the medium-term situation or not. My sense is no, they're not. And then there's no issue about the long-term issue. They're not solving anything on the long-term side. They put forth no big initiatives on the long-term side. Now, then the question is, what do you make of all this? And as Rob said, we're going to proceed in steps. I doubt seriously we're going to solve everything at once. So I think what's clear is that to some extent the budget is a missed opportunity. Now, we had a missed opportunity last year. We had a missed opportunity the year before. We're going to have lots more missed opportunities. It's not fatal to have a missed opportunity, all right? But it is depressing. You said you needed to have a sense of humor to be married to an actress. I think you need to have a sense of humor to be a budget analyst in Washington. At least you have to be strongly resistant to depressive tendencies, yes, exactly. And so this was a particularly big missed opportunity, though, in the pantheon of missed opportunities. And the reason is that last year Obama asked a commission to come up with options to reduce the deficit. And to everyone's surprise, the commission actually did that. They succeeded. They didn't get 14 votes, but they got 11. And they came with a plan. They got votes from the right and the left. Everyone who voted for it made the point that they don't like everything in it, but having a solution is better than not having a solution, and this was a good option compared to doing nothing. So that gave Obama the opportunity basically to do in his budget the same thing, to do what he asked the commission to do, which is to say, here are options for reducing the deficit. I don't love them, but this is a starting point. This is a talking point. I'm taking the plunge following what the fiscal commission did. He basically didn't do that, all right? And that's the missed opportunity. Again, I don't think it's fatal. It just means we have one more budget that's dead in Congress the same week that it gets sent up there. But the situation is getting more dire, and pretty soon we won't be able to afford to miss opportunities. So it's disappointing, but it's not fatal. And we will soldier on and go to plan B, which essentially is people talk behind closed doors and try to work something out. And then next year we'll do the same thing with the budget again. So pardon me if I sound a little fatalistic, and pardon me if I'm not up in arms the way some people in the community are, but this is sort of, in my view, it's sort of one more missed opportunity to deal with these issues, and it actually gives you a sense of why we're in this situation now to begin with. So let me stop there and turn over to Kevin.
Thank you, Bill. Before we go on, I have to, and I forgot to do this, C-SPAN, this is very 20th century of us, but we have to insist that everybody turn off their cell phones. It can interfere with the equipment.
21st?
I'm being 20th century by saying that you cannot be connected all the time. So please turn off the...
What are we going to do about the budget?
Please turn it off. Otherwise, it can interfere. Thank you. Next Next, we'll hear from Kevin Hassett.
Thanks, Rob. And first, let me say that it really is a great pleasure to be here. I think that, as Bill says, that when you're a budget analyst, it's very easy to get all depressed, but one of the things that gives one hope is that there are places like MDN around trying to generate good thinking on how to fix the nation's problems. And while Simon and I don't always agree about everything, I think we always agree about the ultimate objective. And that's why I think that really, if you stop to think about it, there's a lot more cause for optimism than you might think, because our nation has serious problems. But it's like one of my favorite TV shows is the show House, where there's this doctor that solves weird puzzles. And if somebody shows up in the emergency room, they've got a high fever and you don't know why, that's a big problem. If they have kind of a knife in the chest, it's actually good news because you take the knife out, you sew them up, and they're all better. Well, I think that you could think of the U.S. as having a knife in the chest, and it's kind of good news in the sense that we know what the problem is. And I think that we even know how to fix it. And a sign that we know how to fix it is, that I agree with Bill wholeheartedly about the President's Fiscal Commission. I think that they did a fabulous job. I disagree a little bit about exactly the tax and spending mix that they chose. But I think that their work should give one cause for hope because there was some bipartisan support for it. And moreover, I think that the very good people that were working underneath the committee on the bones of the project, like Bruce Reed, are now very important members of the administration. And so I think that if you were handicapping it and you didn't look at the President's budget, then you'd have to say that, well, the nation needs to have more cause for optimism. So I think that there's a seriousness about fixing our problems, a seriousness reflected in a very serious proposal by the President's own commission. And therefore, maybe something good is going to happen. And again, even Gene Sperling, I think that Gene going over to NEC, who's absolutely very popular on both sides of the aisle, he's got a great history of getting bipartisan things done. I think gives one cause for hope. And so then the question is, so why did we get this kind of lame-brained budget where even people on the left and the right were saying, geez, he dropped the ball, he didn't show leadership. I think that we could spend a lot of time speculating, but I think my own view is that the budget is kind of a thing that has a life of its own. And this year's budget has a kind of uncanny resemblance to last year's budget, and that's always true. And I think that kind of bureaucratic sclerosis might be as much of a explanation for the disappointing budget as a political decision to not be a leader. Because I think if the President had decided not to be a leader, then he wouldn't have had the Fiscal Commission. And so I think the dissonance there that Bill remarked upon is something that I share. And so what I'd like to do in my remarks is go forward and talk about what I think the problem is and what I think the solution should look like. And I don't think that Bill said anything that I disagree with, so there's not a debate at this point. Although I should say that I was relieved that we made it this time of year all the way through a Bill presentation without having to listen to something about Duke basketball. But no, I was Swarthmore. I don't brag about basketball. And so I think that the key question is, where are we and what do we do about it? And in terms of where we are, Bill's right. We have high deficits and the near term, the medium term, and the long term. And I think that the high deficits in the medium term and the long term clearly can only be addressed with entitlement reform, and where we are is people are wary of it. But I think that actually fixing those problems, fixing the entitlement problems, is not nearly as complicated as people let on. So for example, if on Social Security we change the indexing formula, maybe in a progressive fashion, and so that future benefits are guaranteed to be at today's level in real terms, but they don't grow with wages, then that essentially puts the Social Security system in balance. You could get a little short of balance if you wanted to be more progressive. On Medicare, my view is that what we should do now is start to commit to having big deductibles in the future. If we tell people now that 10 years from now, when you retire, every year the first X thousand dollars of medical care is going to come out of pocket, then it's amazing how much room that you can buy in terms of balance. And if we say it now, people have time to prepare who haven't retired yet. And you would, of course, make such changes only in anticipation so people could start to plan. I could even see in a grand bargain something that did something like increased Social Security benefits for those at the bottom in an amount enough to pay the future deductible and to grow the two together. So again, that you had a reform that didn't create a risk that people at the bottom wouldn't have the health care that they need. And on the other spending side, it's really, as Bill said, it's kind of almost a sideshow. But it's going to be the most interesting show this year because Mr. Boehner has promised, and the Republicans promised, that they're going to reduce spending by $100 billion in what was really last year. They rolled that back a little bit, and so now it's calendar year, not fiscal year, that they have to get their $100 billion, and they're shooting for 60. Just as an aside, I think that the way that's going to play out is that there's going to be a lot of noise, but in the end, Mr. Boehner will get most of his $100 billion of near-term reduction in exchange for lifting the debt limit, because, frankly, I think that the political wave from last fall was partly explained by revulsion to the high spending. Now, if we do something like this, like repair the entitlements and then do something about discretionary spending, then there's a concern that it might cause some kind of damage to the economy. This relates a little bit to what Bill said about, well, maybe we all like the fact that, or accept the fact that a necessary cost of recovery from the terrible recession we had was a big deficit right now. Therefore, a kind of corollary of that might be, geez, well, we can't really cut spending because the economic cost of that will be too high. I've been doing a lot of work lately looking at the literature that explores what happens to countries that have what we call fiscal consolidations, that they start out with, with a knife in the chest and then they take it out and sew it up. And in that literature, there are two things that people have looked at. One is what happens to growth in countries when you have a fiscal consolidation. And second, when you look at the countries or constrain your view towards countries that succeeded when they had a fiscal consolidation, then what did their consolidations look like? How did they fix the deficit? And I would counsel that with some caution, the lessons from that literature should be drawn on in the U.S. while we start to decide how to fix our problem. And the first lesson is that we shouldn't allow anxiety about near-term growth effects to turn us away from the task. And in fact, there's some evidence, although there's been, I think, some doubt cast on it by some recent work at the IMF, that when a country announces that it's sort of taken the tough medicine and had a fiscal consolidation, that you can get a kind of near-term celebration. One way to think about it would be this, that right now everyone's talking about how U.S. corporations are hoarding their cash and they're not spending it. It's one reason why unemployment is so disappointingly high. Well, one reason they might be hoarding that cash is that they're looking at $1.6 trillion deficits and thinking, geez, at some point they're going to come to me to pay for that, and with future taxes necessarily going up with a deficit that large, then why should I be investing right now so that I'll just have stuff in place that the government can take? If you all of a sudden show businesses a sustainable path, well, then they could sort of be more optimistic and it could unleash a big flow of capital right away. And the evidence is that those effects can really be quite strong. And there's a literature even that's got the title, The Non-Keynesian Effects of Fiscal Consolidations. It's something of a puzzle to economists why it is that when you have a fiscal consolidation that even in the near term you can get some growth. I've been looking very carefully at this literature, and I would counsel some caution of just willy-nilly citing the papers that find the big growth effects. Some work at the IMF, very recent work at the IMF, found that the people who are studying fiscal consolidations were defining consolidations as basically periods when revenue goes up or deficits go down a lot. And the problem with defining it that way, as opposed to on an ex-ante basis looking to see if they passed a bill that had sort of fiscal consolidation in the title, is that something like a stock market boom can make tax revenue surge and the economy boom, but it's not really a policy change. And you wouldn't want to allow the booms that happen, that accompany stock market booms, to color your thinking on what a fiscal consolidation will do to an economy. If you sort of fix that problem and look only at fiscal consolidations that were actually kind of statutory changes in law, and then what you see is that it looks like the growth effects are very small and inconsequential, and that the sort of celebration effect seems to about cancel the sort of negative Keynesian effect of lower government spending. In fact, there's only one type of fiscal consolidation that seems to be stimulative if you fix this problem, and those are consolidations that reduce transfers in the long run, which kind of makes sense because it's, again, putting Social Security and Medicare on firm footing. The second thing that people have looked at, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, is what percentage of the consolidation should be spending and what should be taxes. And on this, if you do it the old-fashioned way that doesn't account for the endogeneity and the stock market effect, or if you do it the new way where you're looking at statutory changes, then both approaches agree that consolidation will only be successful in the sense that it will really reduce the deficit if the majority of the consolidation comes from spending. I have a recent paper with Andrew Biggs and Matt Jensen at AEI where we review the evidence on this. And the range of spending share in the consolidation for successful consolidations is somewhere between, say, 85% spending to maybe about 10 or 15% below that, depending on which samples you're looking at. And so I think that that's kind of something that we all maybe intuitively feel, that as we start to move towards the tough choices we need to fix the economy and to put us on a sustainable path, we're going to have to cut spending, and the spending that we're going to have to cut is entitlement spending, and we're going to have to cut it significantly, and there's not a lot of room for enhanced revenue. But I can say that a 15% increase in revenue is really large, given how big the deficit is, and so there's a big tax hike even in such a proposal. You could look at my recent piece in the Wall Street Journal, co-authored with those two gentlemen, if you want to see how big. But with that, I'd say that I actually feel somewhat optimistic. I think the President's Fiscal Commission was a little bit on the tax side for me, and based on my reading of history, but it was a great first start. And certainly, even if we adopted their proposal, it would be a lot better than where we are. Rob, back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. And finally, Stan Collins.
Thank you. Since you ended with the Fiscal Commission, let me start there. I actually disagree with both of you that it was as big a step as you said it was. There were at least two votes that I counted that voted for, or actually they didn't take a vote for it, but pledged some support for the program, that the two co-chairs laid out only when they knew there wasn't going to be, theirs wouldn't be the number that would get them up to 14. Now, having said that, 11 out of 18 is not an insignificant amount. 9 out of 18 wouldn't have been an insignificant amount, and under most parliamentary systems would have been enough to keep it moving forward. But the two most important votes were the ones that they didn't get, and that's Dave Camp, the current chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and Paul Ryan, the chairman of the Budget Committee. I should note with a little, had they voted for it, it would have been significant because they would have been in a position to implement most of that. They are still in a position, but they're not doing that. And the interesting thing is Ryan yesterday criticized the president for not simply including the commission report in his budget when Ryan voted against it, or expressed no support for it, let's put it that way. So I don't think it was as big a step. I think it was great for policy wonks because it put everything in one place that they wanted to see. The problem with the budget issue, as I see it, there's nothing that was said here that I think was substantively wrong, even though we actually disagree with each other a little bit. The problem is that the budget, as it's evolved, the budget issue is not a rational issue, it's an emotional one. And therefore, everything you guys are saying is true, but we have to get over the emotional hump before any of that can be considered, or will be considered. How emotional or irrational is this? Take a look at any of the polls. There was a recent poll by Reuters that said 71% of Americans don't want the deficit increase. Needless to say, Tea Party and other folks cited that as a reason why they're not going to raise the debt ceiling, which, by the way, they will eventually, but they all use that one top-line headline number. Yet if you look below the poll, the only area of federal spending that got anything close to a majority of support was foreign aid. It's the one that always gets foreign. And the problem is even that overstates the amount of spending they want to cut because the average person thinks that the federal budget is 25% foreign aid. It's not, it's 1 and going down. There's poll after poll like that. I just, in my blog, Capital Gains and Games, yesterday, cited a poll in South Dakota that showed virtually the same thing, that there wasn't any area of spending, in fact it was interesting, other than farm supports that got a majority, or this was close, they got 48% support. Every other area of spending, including Medicare and everything, not even close. What made that poll unique was that it was a poll of Tea Party people in South Dakota. So the Tea Party folks who are adamant that spending has to be cut, when you get below the surface, it's They don't want to lose any of the services they're getting from the government. And that's what makes this debate so irrational. That is, government spending is unpopular. Government services are not. And there's a fundamental difference between those two in the average mind of everybody. I participated in a series of focus groups last year for a client talking about the budget. It was all around the country. It was everything from self-professed liberals to self-professed Tea Party people, Democrats and Republicans. The reactions were virtually the same, no matter where in the country we went or which political party. Everybody thought that spending was a disaster and needed to be cut back, but it could all be done through waste, fraud, and abuse. And I get to this point, not because, there may be $1 trillion in waste, fraud, and abuse in the budget. I doubt it. Only if you define the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Commerce as waste, fraud, or abuse. But I get to this point because what you guys were saying in terms of what has to happen, I think, is the second step. The first step is that we have to get beyond this emotional hump, let's put it that way, this irrational situation. And that's the context in which I think you have to look at the president's budget. A little bit of history here. 1994, Republicans win both houses of Congress 2 years after Bill Clinton had been elected president. Gingrich, Army, and friends. 1995, John Kasich, at the beginning of the year, the then chairman of the House Budget Committee, now governor of Ohio, Kasich was going around the country saying two things. One, if the president doesn't agree with us to cut spending, we may just shut down the government and see if anybody notices. That's almost an exact quote. I'm paraphrasing, but it's almost an exact quote. Second thing he was saying is we, that is Republicans, don't care whether Clinton submits a budget this year. The elections have rendered him and his budget irrelevant. We're just going to start without him. We don't care what he submits. We got our own ideas. Well, they waited, as Congress always do. They waited for the president in 1995. The reason being that with the deficit being an issue in 1995, they assumed that, and everyone was expecting the president would propose large reductions in spending, including Medicare cuts. They were furious when he didn't. He thwarted all those plans for him to go first and to either make it politically acceptable for them to support Medicare cuts or for him to take the heat for doing so. He proposed what, by those standards of that year, was a very vanilla budget. It was called dead on arrival, as every president's budget is these days. But the point is the parallel to this year is extraordinary. A lot of people post the commission were expecting Clinton to come up with bold, innovative ideas. When he didn't, when he came up with a very vanilla budget that barely tweaks the problem, the criticism in 2011 by Boehner and Ryan was virtually the same as the criticism in 1995 by Gingrich and Kasich. Both times they said, we're disappointed in the president's leadership. He's chosen not to lead. We're going to go off and we're going to do this ourselves. And as the Republicans promised in 95 and did, Ryan and Boehner are now saying we're going to produce our own budgets. It's going to have deep entitlement cuts. We're going to do what everyone wanted. The reason I bring this up is I think the situation in 1995 is extremely instructive. Republicans went first in 95, proposed Medicare cuts, got pilloried for doing so. By the time the end of the year came, we had ended up one shutdown in November, one shutdown in end of December, beginning in January. Gingrich, the Republicans, took it on the chin, politically. It was literally the beginning of the end, in my estimation, of Gingrich's speakership. And for those of you who lived through it, and as I look around the audience, there were 6 people who might have. But don't look around. That's first of all, that's rude. Okay, anyway, we'll talk later. So what do I think is going to happen this year? I think it's going to be largely a replay of what happened then. As we get to the continuing resolution towards the, you're shaking your head no, that's fine. That's good. Let's argue. As we get towards March, I think Boehner is going to have to allow the government to be shut once to show, A, the Tea Party that he can do it, and B, show the Tea Party how difficult and how politically painful it's going to be. I can't possibly imagine at this particular moment what compromise on spending levels for 2011 would be satisfactory to the House and Senate. I just don't see it. I'd like to be proven wrong, but I just don't see it. So, in fact, if you watched any of the Sunday talk shows last week, Paul Ryan was on a couple of them. The one I remember the most is Fox News Sunday, where he said, I'd be willing to consider a short-term continuing resolution if it meant that the negotiations were going to continue. What he wasn't asked and what he didn't say was at what level would he be willing to consider a short-term continuing resolution. I find it hard to believe that he would consider or even be able to get past the current continuing resolution. That is, it would have to include deep spending cuts, which I don't think the Senate would agree to. So even if it's only for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And as far as the debt ceiling is concerned, you probably all, or most of you have read the letter from Secretary Geithner to John Boehner and Paul Ryan and others saying what they would have to do if we reached the debt ceiling, and it hadn't been raised. At some point, it's probably about 6 weeks worth of cash management things they could do, borrow from one pocket and put it in another. My view is they've actually got a little bit longer. As I reviewed the techniques, I did a column about this several weeks ago. It's one thing when checks are due, but there are also a variety, and it's very difficult to stop those checks from being paid. But it's another thing if you actually slow down spending currently so that you don't have to start writing checks. And I'm assuming, although there's no way anyone will confirm this, that the agencies have been told if you don't actually have to sign a contract right now, slow it down. Right? If you can reduce the operations of a particular program, slow it down. Doesn't mean the money won't be spent. There are no formal rescissions that are being requested. It'll just be slowed down until after the debt ceiling is eventually done. So I think those who are expecting the debt ceiling to be the real lever, the real hammer to get an agreement of some kind this year, will probably be disappointed because from my perspective, there may be 3-4 months they can go before it becomes a real problem. But bottom line is, for all the substance that we could agree on, I don't think the politics are there to make this happen. And it may be that it need to happen in 2011 what happened in 1996. If you remember the shutdown, I'll give you a quick vignette. In the first shutdown, the first day stories on the news where they had lines of people in Winnebagos and mobile homes trying to get into national parks, furious that the grass was closed. That the trees weren't allowed to grow during the government shutdown, and you weren't allowed to get into Yosemite. I mean, people were pounding on radio stations. For some reason, I remember that. Second day, they showed stories of people trying to get into and get a passport or apply for a visa. Not possible. Third day is when it became interesting. It was when government contractors suddenly realized, damn, there's no one there to process my checks that I need. There's no one there in the loading docks to accept my goods. On the second shutdown, which lasted, I think, 19 days, it only took 5 days before contractors started laying people off. The anger about the unavailability of government services was so hard that so large that it changed the politics of the situation rather substantially. That's the kind of thing I think will drive a deal happening this year. So, with that in mind.
Okay. We're going to exchange comments for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to open it up. I have only one comment. I think it makes a big difference why a government shuts down in terms of its effect. If it shuts down because there are no appropriations, you can juggle these accounts and find ways to keep a lot of things going. It has a political effect, but it doesn't have much of an economic effect. If you shut it down because you haven't raised the debt limit, I think that sends a real shock through financial markets, U.S. and global. We've never done it before. It's never happened. The United States, the U.S. currency and U.S. securities are considered the most risk-free instruments in the world. I think that would have a terrible shock effect, which would be very bad for the economy. At least in the short term, I think they would see it coming and say, can't do that. But in any event, I would want to make that distinction.
I'm not sure you actually shut down the government by not raising the debt ceiling. Appropriations, if they're still in place, I mean, the agencies don't check with the Treasury to see if there's money in the bank before they issue a request for a check.
There's a certain point at which you can't write the checks anymore because...
It's actually, just let me quickly explain the mechanics, because I had to brief the House members that the Republicans agreed on this thing. So basically, the way to think about it is that the Treasury has a bank account at the Fed. And as long as there's money in the bank account, then the Fed clears the checks.
Right.
And there's a lot of money in the Treasury General account at the Fed right now. And basically, if you have a day where you get a lot of income and there aren't a lot of outlays, then your checking account goes up, right? Well, that can happen for the Treasury. There's also a strong seasonal component because, April 15th, it's a little later this year, everybody starts mailing taxes into the government. And so I think that if you basically can run the clock out and keep your checking account alive, the Treasury checking account alive to April 15th, then I think you get through maybe even to the end of June playing the tricks that Stan mentioned. And so you could sort of have a debt limit event but not shut down the government for a window.
You could have a debt limit event that would have significant economic impact without shutting down the government. What I'm saying is I think it would shake confidence in
I
the
think
U.S.
the spectacle
dollar
would be
and
substantial.
U.S. treasuries.
If you didn't make an interest payment, I agree, it'd be a catastrophe.
And just one more thing about this. The ones that are probably most at risk are not bondholders. That is, they'll get paid almost certainly.
They always get paid.
But government contractors are the ones who should be worried.
The more general issue is if the government does hit this limit and can't, for whatever reason, issue checks, there's no established seniority of claims. There's no, you talk to lawyers about this, there's no seniority, so there's a lot of uncertainty created. And, you know, the whole, at the risk of saying the obvious, the whole amount of uncertainty and stress that would create is unnecessary.
Rob, I'd like to just respond to Stan's comparison to the earlier budget shutdown and talk about why I really shook my head for a moment there. And I think that the previous government shutdown was really mismanaged by Republicans, and everyone would have to concede. But I don't see Speaker Boehner making the same kinds of mistakes. So I think that you know, if he was out there looking bombastic and radical, not to sort of accuse previous leaders of being that, then he would be set up exactly right. And one could even say the Obama budget was an attempt to goad such behavior out of Republicans. But I know Mr. Boehner. I think that he's a very sober and calculating person, and that he's not going to fall into traps the way the previous folks did. And I think more importantly, that spending has gone up a lot. The deficit is so large, and the amount that they need to spend maybe in an ultimate deal so close to the current level that it seems kind of unthinkable that they wouldn't be able to get this whole thing to work out without a government shutdown. Because the alternative is that after the last election, you know, Mr. Obama could say, hey, you know, I really don't think, I'm willing to shut down the government. Sure, you passed that bill in the House, but I'm going to veto it, or the Senate. I'm not going to help shepherd it through the Senate because I'm not willing to cut spending this much given this massive deficit. And I think that's a much harder position for him to take. But on your side, I looked at the history of these budget showdowns. The debt limit's gone up, I actually forgot the count, 64 times. It's gone up 62 and down 3, I think, since 1962, which is the year I was born. I don't know why I picked that one. And so it's happened a lot, and there have been a million showdowns, and at every single one I looked at where there was a significant dispute between an administration and the House over whether we should cut this or that, and the House tried to play chicken and get a concession, the president always won. So a president has never really lost one of these showdowns.
Winning being defined by
the debt ceiling went up, and the president didn't shut down the Commerce Department, or to name some of the things that.
By the way, Rob, I picked the Commerce Department by.
Yeah, by accident. The Commerce.
Let me just add two things. There are, number one, there's two fundamental differences. By the way, you heard Boehner the last couple of days. He sounded a little shrill, but there are a couple of fundamental differences between now and '95 that. Yes, they do have the learning experience from 15 years ago. There was no Tea Party 15 years ago, and the Tea Party folks have shown awareness over the first 2 weeks of Congress to roll their own leadership and not necessarily go along. That to me is rather instructive. I don't think a lot of them have gotten calls from constituents yet about what happens when a service is taken away from them, but that's number one. But number two, and maybe much more importantly than Gingrich had an ability that I'm not sure Boehner has, and I don't mean a skill, but Gingrich was allowed to negotiate with Clinton and to come up with a compromise deal. It was what he expected to be there, and it was the way he showed that he was part of the decision-making process. One of the things that's happened over the last 2 years is that compromise has been redefined as collaborating with the enemy. And I don't know whether we've gotten over that yet. Compromising, agreeing with something with the White House, signing on as a co-sponsor, voting for something can easily get you threatened or a real primary by the Tea Party folks if you're a Republican. So I don't know whether the ability to vote for a deal is as great the first time around, and that's why I think a shutdown would change the politics pretty substantially.
I think they're going to shut down at some point for the reasons you mentioned. I wouldn't be surprised if a debt limit gets voted down the first time, and then they come back and they do something and they pass it the second time. But the thing to understand is the debt limit has nothing to do with the projected path of fiscal policy. The debt limit is just an issue of, we have all these bills that have come due from past congressional actions. The only reason we have debt is because Congress spends money and Congress legislates tax changes. So we have this debt coming due from those activities. And raising the debt limit is just an issue of whether Congress agrees that it's going to pay for the obligations that it told the government to have. So it's as if you have a big party, and then the bill comes due and the credit card at the end of the month, you say, no, I don't think I'm going to pay it. Okay? It has nothing to do with whether you're going to have more parties in the future or whether you've scheduled expensive vacations. The problem on the fiscal side is the more parties and the expensive vacations we've scheduled in the future is that the future revenues and future spending are not in balance. But the debt limit has nothing, raising the debt limit right now has nothing to do with that. It just has to do with paying the past bills that are now coming due. So we tend to talk about the debt limit in the same conversation as fiscal policy trajectories, but they're totally separate.
But the reason why they're connected this time, Bill, is that Congress wants to say, okay, we're going to pay the credit card bill, but we're going to cut up the credit card. They want to get some kind of credible commitment not to have a future party out of the president.
Cut the credit card anytime it wants to. The only reason we spend money is because Congress authorizes it. Congress doesn't need anyone else to force them to stop spending. They can do it themselves. The fact is they can't.
Well, I think you're right. The debt limit is not a fiscal issue, but it is a financial system issue.
Oh, certainly.
And
they can do enormous damage.
Enormous damage.
And without doing anything to actually solve the long-term fiscal problem.
Let me just point out one thing, and that is, the deficit. I do a lot of work in climate change, and one of the first things I recognized in climate change is that it's one of the hardest things in politics because enacting climate legislation, because it entails asking people to absorb short-term costs in order to avoid a larger long-term cost. And that's almost impossible to get people to do. It's hard enough to get people to absorb short-term costs for a long-term benefit. That's kind of the model of Social Security. But to avoid a long-term cost, that particularly when you can't specify exactly what that cost is going to be, where it's going to hit, when it's going to hit, people say, hey, wait a minute, I'll wait to see the cost before I am ready to pay anything. And so you have to figure out a way, in effect, to reduce that short-term cost. Reducing the deficit is very similar. We are asking people to absorb short-term costs in order to avoid a larger long-term cost. Now, we're also saying there will be a long-term benefit of an economy with a much more manageable debt. But I do think that means, at a minimum, that we don't really get a significant agreement on either revenues or entitlements until we have a strong economy, until people feel better about the economy and consequently feel they can absorb marginal costs, or those costs are targeted to relatively small groups. That's the other option. That was the Clinton approach in '93, for example, that the real costs were borne by high-income people, a fairly small share. And there were a lot of defense cuts, but hey, we just won the Cold War. That paved the way.
But haven't we tried that, and it hasn't worked the last couple of years? The president tried to limit the tax extension and tax cuts, right?
Well, interestingly enough, the country supported it. The public supported ending those tax cuts. But the party dynamics didn't support it. And so we're not there yet. As I said, I honestly believe we only get to those issues once we come to agreement on smaller issues, and that lays a foundation for the biggest issues. Why don't we take some questions from, okay. If you could identify yourself.
Yes, thank you. Does this work? Yes. Uri Dadouche of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I look at this from the international perspective, and I was actually quite surprised at the relaxed sort of tone of the conversation because, when I compare with the international aggregates, United States really is not looking in very good shape. And in fact, today the United States is the only country, the only advanced country other than Japan that is not confronting its long-term fiscal issues in a decisive way. You know, once the UK began to do it and the Europeans are doing it, Japan and the United States are the two standouts. And so somehow other countries are able to incur the short-term cost. And so that's one question. What is it about the United States that makes it difficult to incur the short-term cost when other countries do? And the other question I have is on taxes. I understand the point about relative benefits of cutting expenditure against increasing taxes. But if I compare United States with other countries, so other countries, advanced countries, have very large value-added tax, yeah? 15, 20% in the case of the Europeans. They have a large gasoline tax, and they also have phased out over time the mortgage interest tax credit, by and large. I'd like to understand, these are three obviously potentially very large sources of revenue. I'd like to understand in the same context of my general context of the question, how feasible any of these options look at the moment in the United States.
Why don't we go down the line and you can respond to whatever part.
These are the guys, these are the tax experts. It's,
well, or the internet.
Well, all right. The one thing I would say about, I'm willing to bet the value-added tax is coming at some point. I don't know how big, I don't know when. I can't imagine it would be done in the absence of overall tax reform, quite honestly, and it could be part of that. One of my co-bloggers, Bruce Bartlett, has been advocating for it and predicting it to come for a couple of years at least. So I would say that that's on the horizon. On the others, on the mortgage interest deduction, for example, there are huge. First of all, I mean, it's almost 70%, 66% of Americans own their own home, bought it with a tax deduction, would like to be able to have the tax deduction there when they want to sell it. You know, so that's number one. There's a huge public support for it. There's also a huge support on the interest group side between mortgage bankers and those types of things. It's not the kind of thing you could simply get through Congress by snapping your fingers if it wasn't part of a much, much larger reform. And just one more thing about that. In the past, when we've talked about flat taxes and things, as soon as you point out to folks that the flat tax would eliminate the mortgage deduction for them and the charitable interest deduction and a couple other large ones, they said support for the flat tax just goes away within seconds.
First, the international issue about the U.S.'s intransigence and what it might mean. I wrote a recent article about this, which I could email you if I get your contact info after, where I looked at the debt stance of other countries in the year that they lost their AAA rating, and found that the U.S. was sort of already in the middle of the pack. Like maybe you could say we should have lost it already, but even if we go out to the country that lost it the latest, then we're just a few years away. And I would guess that if Bill's pessimism about progress bears fruit, and it turns out that's what happens, then it's not that long until the AAA rating, and even there have been some warnings from the agencies, the AAA rating is gone. And now that's not an overnight calamity, but I wonder, it's almost a question for my co-panelist, whether that might not be the kind of event that would finally make people be serious. On the tax side, I think that if you look at the U.S., everybody right now is, including myself, whining about the corporate rate about to be the highest on earth. But there are a number of ways in which our system is just out of whack with the rest of the world. We don't have a value-added tax, and so therefore we have relatively high income taxes because we don't have the value-added tax. And there are a few other things that we do that are really quite a bit different. Most countries also have a payroll tax where the employer side is a lot bigger than the employee side, and it's not capped at a certain point. And there are a lot of reasons Bill and I could talk to you about why payroll taxes can often be a kind of more efficient tax too. And so there's a lot of room for us to improve the tax system, and it's really frustrating that we're not doing it. And I would say that Bill and I have been frustrated over tax reform and had a kind of a view that was quite similar, probably as long as we've been frustrated over this sort of ducking the debt issue.
So just to follow up on everything that Kevin said, I have written and advocated for all three of the policies you've talked about. I think the VAT, the gas tax, and trimming or getting rid of or converting the mortgage interest deduction to something else. I think all those changes make sense. I'm guessing that at least two of them are going to be necessary because I don't know how we cut spending, given the numbers that Stan mentioned. I don't know how we cut spending enough to reach a sustainable situation otherwise. In terms of why we're not like other countries, I don't know exactly, but it is interesting in parliamentary systems like the United Kingdom, the government says, here's the new policy, and it gets implemented. And then the U.S., they say, here's the new policy, the administration says, and everyone says, ha-ha, you got to be kidding, and it's dead. And, I mean, our government is designed not to be able to do big things fast, and it's certainly effective, you know. Sometimes that's an advantage, sometimes it's a disadvantage. Right now it's a disadvantage. In the 90s, it was an advantage. The economy was going strong, there was gridlock, great, let them do nothing. The economy was taking off, right? Right now that we have big problems in the short term, we have big problems in the long term, we need a government that can actually address those issues, and for a variety of historical, political reasons, we don't have it.
I certainly agree the parliamentary system is a critical distinction here, but frankly, I would take issue with most of the rest of your views. The reason the United States is not in danger of that kind of loss of confidence is because the rate of return in the United States is much higher. The productivity growth is much higher. The underlying economy has been judged to be sounder, which is why the per capita income is about $10,000 greater in the United States than in the EU 15. We are seeing some progress, some ability to really address this in Japan, which has always had the ability. I mean, Japan has been ahead of everyone else in pension reform for a long time. That is, they were willing to take bigger steps. Of course, they have a bigger problem than anybody else, a larger demographic problem. And England is now, and England has a history of doing this too. They did it under Thatcher. I can't say that France and Germany have any record of addressing these problems, and certainly the pension problem in Europe is worse than it is here, largely because of demographics, and actually it's a combination. The retirement system is much more generous in continental Europe than here, and so the burden of benefits is much larger, and the demographics are much worse, mainly because immigration is so restricted in Europe. Our demographics are bailed out by very high immigration rates. So I can understand the distinction and why, and I don't agree, I suppose, with Kevin that in these terms, in rational terms, in terms I think of as rational, that the U.S. credit rating should be at risk.
Hi, I'm Zach Kolodin from the Roosevelt Institute Campus Network, and we're a group of 86 student think tanks across the country based on college campuses. Incidentally, Swarthmore's our latest chapter. So we were invited by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, along with AEI, I believe, to participate in the Fiscal Solutions Summit in New York. And so we sort of have been going through this process along with a number of other think tanks. One of the things that we started looking at in order to come up with the solution was sort of what had driven this short-term deficit and medium-term deficit over the past 10 or 15 years. And we found that since this isn't something, the short-term isn't anything like what we were experiencing around the turn of the century. So we found that the massive cost of the war, the tax cuts not being offset in the early 2000s, and then the counter-cyclical response to the recovery is sort of the main drivers of these. And we thought that perhaps our solution should take those into account too and look forward. How will drivers like that continue to cause problems for us? And so one of the main ones is obviously rising healthcare costs, which seems like it burdens the government. It burdens the people just as much as it burdens the government. The lack of a kind of grand strategy for defense might lead to big investments in war down the road. So it seems like when we talk about these things, there's not a whole lot of discussion of the drivers. It's mainly about getting the numbers to match up in some way or another, when it's not the structural forces that caused our short-term deficit right now. So do you think that there's a chance for us to have a real conversation about the drivers of spending over the next few years, or do you think that the problem as it's cast in Washington is kind of too sclerotic and focused on kind of the specific lens that the CBO wants to look at this problem through?
I could go first just because you mentioned AEI, but I look forward to hearing what Stan and Bill have to say. That I think that you're exactly right, that looking at the cost drivers is something that hasn't happened and needs to. And I'll give an example that's a little bit outside of the area of the panelists, at least as far as I know, which is defense spending. I think we all agree that Congress tends, and even politicians tend to want to do more but fund less. And so I think that if you have a military objective that's just very wide and poorly defined, then likely it's the case that defense spending is way too low for what we're asking our military to do. If you wanted to reduce defense spending, then you ought to have an honest debate about, well, what should the U.S. Armed Services do? What is an objective that we all support, and what is something that we think is too far from a primary interest of the U.S. And that debate could take account of the fact that there maybe is a free rider problem, that if we have a big military that's policing the seas, then other people don't have to, and maybe that free rider problem is indelible, maybe it's not. That's the kind of debate that one you would really need to have if we're going to say, well, geez, could we get a % of GDP out of reducing defense in the future? I think that to do that, I would guess, just like with entitlements, we could only do it if we're willing to give something up. And nobody's having that conversation. And I think that's a real impediment to progress.
So you're right that the drivers of the short-term deficit are different from the drivers of the long-term deficit. That's another way of saying what I said at the beginning, which is the short-term, medium-term, and long-term deficit are different issues. Okay? And so I think it's totally right. The important thing to remember, I think, is the deficit is a difference between spending and taxes. And so we can choose to support a high level of Medicare and Medicaid if we want to, as long as we are willing to contribute the taxes necessary to maintain that health care expenditure. We could cut Medicare and Medicaid to the bone and support it with the current level of expenditure, as long as we're willing to live with that. So there's a balance issue between what happens on the tax side and what happens on the spending side in the long term that I think is central. And it comes down to what kind of government do you want? Kevin mentioned kind of rethinking the U.S. posture in the world. That's right, we need to do that. We also need to rethink the social contract at home, because, and this comes back to something Stan said at the beginning, the American public's not ready to have this discussion. They want lower taxes and more spending. That's not really on the table as an option. Which is one reason, by the way, I thought the Fiscal Commission report was important, because if we can change the discussion from, well, don't touch my mortgage interest deduction, or don't touch my taxes, or don't raise the gas tax, if we can change the discussion from that to, here's my plan to solve this. If you don't like it, tell me your plan, right? If we can have a debate among plans that actually solve the problem, then that's sort of the first big step to get over this hurdle that Stan was talking about earlier, that people don't get this. The first step is obviously that people have to get it. So I applaud what you're doing, and we need, a lot more groups doing the same thing.
I don't want to I don't want to destroy your young and impressionable mind here. Yeah, okay.
That's what old guys.
I'm not sure, as correct you are in terms of analyzing the problem that you are, that is, how did we get here? I'm not sure it makes much difference to those who are looking to use it as an excuse to do something else. That is, for many people, the fact that there were tax cuts that were unpaid for that drove the deficit, et cetera, is irrelevant. They've defined this as a spending issue. All right? this is why I keep saying, be careful about being too rational about this. That's not to say that discussion shouldn't take place, just like Bill was saying, but coming up with what you think is the definitive answer of how we got here from here may not make much difference in terms of what the solution they ultimately come up with. It's just, there are some folks taking advantage of the situation to push their own agenda.
We say that in an open political system like the United States, the resolution of these problems is often determined by the distributional effects. And that's what the fights are over. Everybody knows that some spending is going to be cut, some taxes are going to be raised, but some spending is not going to be cut and some taxes aren't going to be raised. There's going to be a distribution of costs to bring down this deficit that will not be equal and subject to enormous debate. One of the reasons why tax increases at the top are a very popular way is because it puts all the burden on a fairly small number of people. Now you can justify that and say, well, they have the resources to bear that burden. The same thing is true of how we address Medicare. This is going to be a matter of the distribution of costs among elderly people with higher deductibles, for example, or physicians and hospitals with lower reimbursement rates, or pharmaceutical firms and equipment manufacturers with something that begins to look like price controls, or non-elderly people and non-healthcare industries who will end up bearing more taxes, for example, through a value-added tax, if that were the way that we decided to finance healthcare, which I think actually makes a lot of sense as an economist. But it's not going to be decided by the economics of it. It's going to be decided by the politics which arise out of the distribution of the costs and the distribution of benefits. And that's what we really have to think through when we're trying to figure out what kind of package can actually draw support from both parties. Our time is just about up. I want to make one announcement, and that is next week, this debate or this discussion at NDN continues Tuesday, is that correct? When Jason Furman, the Principal Deputy National Economic Advisor and Assistant to the President, will be here to give an address. And my guess is that the budget will come up at that and fiscal policy, and we hope that you'll continue to be part of NDN's discussion of these issues, which will go on not only through this year, but into the next of the next of the next. Thank you.
Thank you.